I'm Alice Loxton and I present documentaries over on History Hit TV. If you're passionate about all things history, sign up to History Hit TV. It's like Netflix but just for history. We've got hours of ad-free documentaries about all aspects of the past. You can get a huge discount from History Hit TV. Make sure you check out the details below and use the code ABSOLUTEHISTORY, all one word, when you sign up. Now, on with the show.
This beautiful city in the north of England is known for its prominent role in the industrial age, for its beautiful variety of different forms of architecture, and of course, for its football prowess. So come on you Reds, or come on you Blues, and let's get curious about Manchester.
With nicknames like Cottonopolis, the Worker Bee City, the Free Trade City, and the Warehouse City, Manchester is forever known as the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s, which is why, to this day, you will see a ship on the city crest, a cotton bud atop its city hall, many, many warehouses, a soaring Royal Exchange, and even an entire museum dedicated to its innovations in railway history. So, here's what I'm curious about in Manchester. Who splashed around inside Manchester's Water Palace? What was the reason that football became so popular here? Where did Railway Mania begin? Why does this library look like a Gothic cathedral? When did all these bees get here, and when did patrons get swept out of this darling old pub? How did Manchester get its name, and what does gender have to do with it? So much to be curious about in Manchester. Manchester has plenty of beautiful architecture and Victorian splendor to explore. But if you really want to get curious about this oh-so-industrious city, you're going to have to get your hands dirty. So, we begin our curious exploration into the Worker Bee City. The worker what? Yep, when you first arrive in Manchester, you will notice some cute little yellow and black striped mascots all over town. It has nothing to do with honey, or flowers, or artisanal hipsters, but in fact a very important clue to Manchester's heritage and history. Why all the bees? Well, of course, it all goes back to the industrial age again, when inside those textile factories, it was described as being a hive of activity, and the workers, of course, described as the worker bees. So that nickname has been buzzing around Manchester ever since. The busy bee is even on Manchester's coat of arms, busily buzzing around the globe. And that globe symbolizes the trading power that put Manchester on the map. And how Manchester became a world leader in trade is a curious bit of history.
In the early 1800s, Manchester was a leader in the Industrial Revolution. But they had one small problem: how to move goods from one place to another. The solution? Just build a railway.
On September 15, 1830, history was made when a train left Liverpool and arrived here in Manchester, the first railway to link two major English cities. This seemingly short trip of only about 30 miles became the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, billed as the first modern railroad. And this innovation began Britain's Railway Mania, with dozens more train lines built all over Britain, and later inspired hundreds more around the world. And here's what's great: you can still stand on the exact spot where that historic train arrived. How? Well, because this spot is now preserved as part of Manchester's Science and Industry Museum. But before that record-breaking railway, there were some rollicking Romans who built a fort on this site and gave us the name Manchester. Well, sort of.
Hannah said it happened on the
The Romans set up shop in Manchester around 80 AD, but not just in any spot, the perfect spot.
We are standing where Manchester truly began.
They come here and, as usual with Romans, they just know exactly where to put the most perfect location. So they look around, see that Manchester's in a bowl of hills, and all roads basically lead to this central point. It's the hub of a wheel of hills, so that's why they come here.
And Manchester became a hub of a different sort too, a spoke in a wheel of roads, leading out from this fort, connecting to other Roman forts and towns in England. But as crucial as those roads and this fort were to the origins of Manchester, that is not what makes this spot so curious. Back in these ancient Roman times, Manchester was called Mamucium, not Mancinian as once believed, which brings us to a funny bit of history.
Here was a great location. You were where two rivers met, the Medlock and the Irwell, on a slight rise of the hill, which is why the name is very funny, the Roman name, on a slight rise of the hill, and they thought this is the perfect next step, because the name is very funny.
How do you pronounce the name correctly?
Well, the Victorians, who had a strong sense of self, thought the Roman name was Mancinian.
Okay.
So some of those then, and that's in a mural in the town hall, some of them thought, who didn't speak Latin, yes, because we were the first city of industry, so city of men, masculine, virile, the first city of industry. We now know, through modern scholarship, that the real Roman name was Mamucium.
Mamucium, okay.
Yeah, which means breast-shaped hill. So instead of the city of men,
like Mary.
so So the Anglo-Saxons came along and gave us a sex change. We went from mam to man.
I love that.
So the modern name really should be Mamchester, not Manchester, if you think about it. But Manchester stuck, and today a Manchester resident is called a Mancunian. Next in our Manchester history, the city didn't develop around the original fort. Instead, medieval Manchester developed in a different area, where some very important kitty cats once reigned. During the Middle Ages, beautiful Manchester Cathedral was built, and next to the cathedral is its close, which encloses this beautiful sandstone church complex. Some of these buildings were used as the priest's college. And it is no small miracle that these beautiful buildings have survived. In fact, this is one of the most complete medieval church complexes in all of England. And why it has survived so long is the next chapter of Manchester's history, a collection of chapters and books, actually. The precious Chetham's Library, the oldest public library in the English-speaking world. Chetham's Library was created in the 1650s in the will of Humphrey Chetham, who was a very successful merchant in Manchester. Chetham's Library's collection includes more than 40 medieval manuscripts, rare books on Middle English poetry, and incredible rare and detailed archival collections on the history of Manchester and the northwest of England. And to have a library of this caliber in the 17th century was hugely important to Manchester.
What kind of a resource was this for scholars and others? What sort of books were they getting access to and filling their minds with knowledge that they wouldn't have had otherwise?
This is a very, very major resource, effectively. The people of the Northwest had complained under the reign of Charles I and later that they had no university within easy reach. 2 universities in England, Oxford and Cambridge, 3 already in Scotland, and they want more. So people come a long way to get to this place.
And to get to study in this environment must have been inspiring. And visiting it today is like stepping back in time.
As you walk through, you just can't help but notice you've got this gorgeous dark wood and you've got the white ceiling with the beams. Was this already the architecture here when it was being used as part of the church, or what was changed? Or
not a great deal's changed. On the first floor, they enlarged the windows to get more light in. Otherwise, we're looking at the roof, walls, and substantially the architecture of the medieval period of the 1420s. The roof is the original timber because they've done dendrochronology work on it, tree ring dating. and the felling date of a lot of the trees is early 1420s, so it's pretty original.
Amidst all this serious history, there is one more funny bit of history about why all the books are stored on the second floor.
We're on an upper floor. The books are on an upper floor for a very important reason.
That's right. Here they have got a ground floor, but they don't put the books there because they're worried about damp, they're worried about mice, rats. The library kept cats till the 1970s to make sure that they didn't get in charge.
It's not that they necessarily loved the cats were to be in charge of the rat.
I think they seem, and not only that, there are holes in the medieval doors downstairs that are cat flaps, so going right back, they keep them around.
I love it.
Next, we visit another historic Manchester library, but this one is a wee bit bigger.
The John Rylands Library houses some of the world's finest rare books and manuscripts. It was opened on January 1st, 1900, and is named after John Rylands, who was one of Manchester's first multimillionaires. Rylands made his fortune during the industrial age in the textile industry. At his home, he had a wonderful collection of books in his library, and that collection, after his death, went on to become this library. But that history is not what makes this library so curious.
The John Rylands Library is considered one of the finest neo-Gothic buildings in all of Europe. The library was one of the first buildings in all of Manchester to use electricity, and those torchères light the way, beginning at the original entrance hall. This dramatic statue, called Theology Directing the Labors of Science and Art, sets the stage for the church-themed style. That hall leads to this gorgeous staircase with another torchère, looking straight out of Harry Potter. From the staircase, we go to the historic reading room, again looking just like a church, with the library's most magnificent vaulted ceiling complete with stained glass and a central nave of sorts, with some curious little niches on each side. It's the perfect place to study for a very curious reason.
As you can see along the main aisle, there are all of these wonderful little alcoves, all provided for quiet study. In fact, the original architects were so smart about providing a quiet study environment that they built this ground level 30 feet above ground. Why did they need to do that? Well, this was during the Victorian era, of course, back when we had very noisy horse and carriages with their noisy feet on the noisy cobblestone streets.
So our two historic libraries, both John Rylands and Chetham's, are elevated. One to keep the noise out and the other to keep the mice out. From a temple dedicated to improving the mind to a temple dedicated to improving the body, let's dive on into a beautiful bit of Manchester history.
At the turn of the 20th century, Manchester was thriving, so much so that leisure activities could be enjoyed by all the classes. And what could be more leisurely than the Victoria Baths, known as Manchester's water palace for a very obvious reason.
This doesn't quite look like your average public pool, does it? Not a chance. When it opened in 1906, the Lord Mayor of Manchester described the Victoria Baths as the most splendid municipal bathing institution in the country, and a water palace of which every citizen of Manchester can be proud. This true water palace is all decked out in vivid Art Nouveau ceramic tiles, beautiful wrought iron railings, and intricate stained glass windows, including the famous Angel of Purity. Even little fishies swim around under your feet in these ancient Greece-inspired mosaic floors. But there is more here than immediately meets the eye.
Probably like most first-time visitors, what the first impression I had when you're outside, oh my goodness, it's so luxurious. And you look a little closer and you see 3 different entrances. Male first class, male second class, and then just ladies, just all the ladies. You know, in modern times it seems a bit strange.
Well, certainly when the baths first opened in 1906, there was that segregation. And it was dependent on what you could pay in terms of the male's first class and male's second class. But there was no choice. choice. Females went in the females' entrance. And I don't know if you know, the 3 pools are different sizes.
I noticed that.
We got the short straw in those days, didn't we?
As with everything else, as with everything else.
But of course, this was absolutely normal in the Victorian and Edwardian days. The idea of men and women swimming together would be enough to make a proper lady faint. Mixed bathing, as it was called, was introduced with great caution in 1914. And soon, men, women, and families were happily swimming together on Sunday mornings here. But before that, in 1906, these little changing rooms, as cute and feminine as they are, were actually designed for men first class.
Hello.
Hi.
It's funny that, you know, with the grand pool and the grand elevated ceilings and the stained glass, these little changing rooms, I think, are my favorite feature.
Really?
Yeah.
They are lots of people's favourite feature of Victoria Bath. The tiles are original. The colour, you can see from underneath the chipped away paint. It was green in a past life and it's blue at the moment. But what it started out at, I really couldn't say. Who knows what colour it was, yeah.
And what guests would change into is just as charming as the changing rooms.
What I think a lot of people find very charming about this era, so it was opened in 1906, talk about the bathing costumes that people would be wearing. Not exactly like the same bikinis and swim trunks we wear today.
Well, certainly they covered up more of the body than they do today.
From the pools to the spas, the Turkish baths were very luxurious and very innovative for their time. There was also one of the very first whirlpools in Britain. And there's one last area that had an even simpler but extremely considerate purpose. That is, if you were considerate about the noses of your fellow Mancunian.
So this particular room, it doesn't seem like there's as much to see, but to me it's one of the more interesting rooms that tells about the history. So what happened in this room?
This housed the bathing bath. So the male's first class gentlemen would come in here for their weekly bathe.
I know this already about history, but we need to be reminded, people only bathed once a week.
Well, yes, I dare say it could have been on what you could afford, whether you bathed more regularly. But I think particularly maybe the less well-off people that came to the baths for their bathe would have been once a week. Yes.
Gosh.
Yes.
So, the luxurious water palace also served a very important function for the general public: hygiene. And to get to submerge into this seemingly never-ending source of clean water must have been a delight. Next, now that we're all cleaned up, time to explore some of Manchester's historic buildings, like the Royal Exchange, built in the early 1800s, where all that cotton wealth was bought and sold. It was described as the largest room in all of Europe for a time. But there's another Manchester building that has nothing to do with trade, but may have been where traders went at the end of the day. A very curious pub in Shambles Square.
This is the Old Welly, or the Old Wellington Inn, one of the oldest buildings here in Manchester. It was believed to have been built in 1552, and its half-timber style is just absolutely darling. Connected to it is Sinclair's Oyster Bar, and it has a curious little story attached to it. It was believed that the pub was only open from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m., and if the patrons didn't get out at exactly 8 o'clock, then the landlady would shoo them out with a mop.
But the story gets even more curious. The Old Wellington and Sinclair's didn't start out in these spots. After surviving centuries of history, including the Blitz, these precious bits of Manchester history were moved piece by piece, more than 100 yards down the road during the 1990s, when a section of Manchester was being renovated. Next, from Shambles Square to another square with a bit more flair and a royal touch.
This is Manchester's beautiful town hall with all kinds of wonderful little architectural details all along its exterior. My favorite, though, is way up at the top, where instead of a revered leader, of course, here in Manchester, the symbol has to be a cotton bud.
And that cotton bud, the symbol of Manchester's wealth, tops off this Grade 1 listed building. Less than 3% of England's historic buildings have Grade 1 status. Manchester's Town Hall stretches the entire length of Albert Square, named for Prince Albert and his memorial statue. Below that cotton bud are some historical figures you might recognize. But this guy over the main entrance you may not recognize. That's General Agricola. Who's he? Well, he would know that his city should be called Manchester, not Manchester. Why? Well, because he's the Roman general who founded Mamucium. Our final stop takes us to a spot that's a bit more sleek and modern on the outside, but is full of rugged Manchester history inside.
Mancunians are proud of their history, their heritage, their architecture, and their worker bee spirit. But there is only one thing that they are truly obsessed with, and that's their football.
I don't think you're even allowed to live in Manchester if you're not a football fan. So it is fitting that the National Football Museum is here. This unique museum is inside the uber-modern Urbis building. There are 6 levels with all manner of interactive exhibits, a Hall of Fame, and 2,500 bits of football memorabilia on display at any given time. And lest ye think that football is only a man's sport, let's not forget that Manchester's true name really should be Manchester.
There's all kinds of interesting bits of football history that you can learn here, including the history of women's football. Look what women used to have to wear on the field. You can see these baggy pants here, to be modest. And then on the heads, no helmets or anything to protect, but instead a nice little frilly bonnet with a little blue ribbon, of course, just to be pretty. My favorite part of the uniform, though, look at these boots. Can you imagine running around and kicking a ball wearing these things?
So, how did all this football mania start? How and when English football began is a hotly debated topic. It is possible that the earliest versions began in China, Japan, or Greece, then moved to Rome. It is believed that when the Romans invaded Britain, they brought football with them. Well, that was polite. But the more modern version of English football is much easier to document. And wouldn't you know it, as with everything else in Manchester, it goes back to that worker bee heritage.
I love, as we're going about town and learning the history, everything really ties to the industrial age. So the football actually came out of that. Was it the factory workers just needing some entertainment after work? They were playing each other in the open fields?
Exactly. So the idea was, back in the days, rugby was even more popular than football. But workers, because in rugby you had so many injuries, which could stop you to work for a couple of months, then you couldn't earn money. So football was the second option, the safest option. So the workers used to play football, to just entertain, and that was it.
And to this day, football is the sport of the working class, which is a good thing here in the proudly busy worker bee city of Manchester.
Dare I ask, which team do you root for, or is that not a good question to ask anybody?
Oh, proud. I'm a United fan here. Yeah, of course, red.
While Manchester City and Manchester United may forever be battling it out on the pitch, there's one thing they definitely agree on. If you look closely at each team's logos, both have a ship on it, a nod to the Manchester City Council coat of arms and its long legacy of trade that made the original City of Industry what it is today. So, from a manly Roman fort with a feminine name, that became the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, with all its factories and innovations that got so big that an entire railway had to be built. And its workers became known as worker bees, giving the city its symbol. And as the wealth grew, the city grew, with beautiful buildings from the royal trading halls to city halls to a couple of curious libraries, thanks to those wealthy industrialists. And businessmen and workermen and lovely ladies alike would enter another beautiful building, a water palace, decked out in Edwardian extravagance and followed Edwardian manners.
Say bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And finally, another more modern building that is a temple to a true Manchester pastime that sprang out of those worker bee factories and continues to be the vehicle for the pride of this city of industry, whether that pride be painted red or blue. Manchester has so much to be curious about.
Thank you for joining us on our educational journey, and hopefully now you're even more curious about the who, what, where, why, when, and how of curious Manchester, from Mamucium to Mancunian.